Colorado judge and Supreme Court nominee Neil Gorsuch meeting with Colorado Senator Cory Gardner and other lawmakers last week as he made the rounds on Capitol Hill. And if confirmed, Gorsuch would be the second Colorado judge to ever sit on the nation's highest court. The other, former Justice Byron White. And getting that confirmation won't be easy for Judge Gorsuch. Democrats are promising to fight when hearings start in about 6 weeks. This after President Obama's nominee Merrick Garland was blocked for 10 months. President Trump says to prevent a filibuster, Senate Republicans should invoke the so-called nuclear option.
But if we end up with that gridlock, I would say, if you can, Mitch, go nuclear, because that would be an absolute shame if a man of this quality was caught up in the web.
Going nuclear ends the need for nominees to get 60 votes. Instead, the nomination would be decided by a majority vote. Now, joining us today is Sue Casey, and some of you may recognize her from her days on Denver City Council. She's also advised presidential candidates. She's written 2 books, including her new one, Appealing for Justice, which is the story of one Colorado lawyer for decades and the landmark gay rights case of Romer v. Evans. The book is about a civil rights leader right here in Colorado. You spent a lot of time on this. First, tell us about Jean Dubofsky.
Well, Jean Dubofsky, many people know her as the first woman on the Colorado Supreme Court. That was in 1979, before we even had a woman on the U.S. Supreme Court. And they know her because she argued the Romer v. Evans case. But she lived a life in justice and spent her life on behalf of many, many people who are left out and left behind. And her story is, like so many people, it's an untold story. We know history, but we know it of the 5 or 6, usually guys, who tell the story of generations. But there are many people like Jean who lived a life that changed a part of history. And hers is a very rich story.
Because she truly is a civil rights leader that probably a lot of Coloradans don't know, that she had great impact here in our state and across the country.
She did. You know, she started her career as a young lawyer in the 60s. Actually, she started with Walter Mondale, doing strategy with he and some of the giants of the Senate to get the 1968 Civil Rights Act passed. And then her first job as a young lawyer, she went to Florida and on behalf of migrant workers. And as a young justice advocate, she brought the first lawsuit against slavery since the Civil War. And as she tells the story, I didn't know what else to do, so I just brought a lawsuit. But she stepped into positions where people needed an advocate. And she started with the slavery lawsuit. She moved up to do work in Colorado for legal aid on behalf of women, on behalf of the poor, on behalf of farm workers here, and then went on to do incredible things her whole life.
Yeah, and let's talk about Amendment 2, because for those of us who went through that time period, that was a tough time for a lot of Coloradans to figure out who we really are and what we believe in.
It was a terrible time. You know, gays and lesbians had been really left out, stigmatized, hated for decades. And during the 1980s, primarily because of AIDS, but other activism, they began to step up and step out, and some local cities decided that it was wrong that they could be discriminated against, that they couldn't live in certain areas, that they would be fired if they were found out, and passed some, Aspen, Boulder, Denver, passed some local ordinances. Amendment 2 came along because of the interest of the anti-gay folks who didn't want protections for gays. And it was a crazy election. You know, that was when Ross Perot was on the ballot. That's when we passed Tabor. And no one thought Amendment 2 could possibly pass to prevent cities and towns from doing the kind of protections they wanted to do. But it did pass. And Colorado and Coloradans just couldn't believe that that actually happened.
And she's the one who took it all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court.
She took it all the way to the Supreme Court. A small group of lawyers were wise enough to say, well, it looks like it won't pass, but just in case, let's put together a team to be ready. And on election eve, at 10 o'clock on election night, they started to worry. And by 6 a.m. the next morning, she and her team were ready to go.
And she went and fought it. Talk about this book. Why her story, and why you writing it?
You know, stories are important in our history, and the untold stories are usually the ones that tell us what really happened from the ground up, from the ordinary people. And I was intrigued with her ever since I met her in 1990, because as a woman, you know, we've had our share of what it feels like. And some of us had a little trace of anger sometimes and resentment and just trying to make your way in the world. And I met this woman who, as I found out more about her, had her own share of discrimination against
right.
her, and yet she had a calmness and a dignity, and she just kept going. And I've thought for years, I think there's a story for all of us behind how to be one of the first women to have a seat at the table. And I bet there's a lot to learn. Little did I know what a great story it would turn out to be.
Well, Sue, thank you so much for being here. I know we could talk about this for so much longer, but there are some great stories in here I think a lot of people can relate to, just going through history of Colorado, history of the U.S., and just the battles, as you say, that women have gone through over there.
And you know, it's a story of her in the past, but it's a story of today in our lives too. So I thank you for having me.
Fascinating. Thank you, Susan Casey. Appreciate you being here. We'll be right back.